In the center's perfectly manicured garden, the service dog Doc suddenly pulled his owner, Grant, toward a hidden corner. There, on a weathered bench, an old veteran sat in silence. As Doc gently approached, the man glanced around, trembling, before furtively pulling up his sleeve. In the sunlight, a dark bruise and the signs of cruel neglect were revealed for just a second, before he quickly hid it, his eyes locking with Grant's in terror as he pressed a single finger to his lips. That silent plea said everything, and Grant knew he had just stepped into a fight from which there was no retreat. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. What city or country are you listening from? The Oregon air, crisp and damp with the scent of pine, was supposed to be a new beginning for Grant. After 20 years as an Army medic, the quiet life was a prescription he had written for himself. He was a man in his 40s, tall and with a lean but sturdy frame that spoke of a life of discipline. His short brown hair was threaded with silver at the temples, framing a face that held the gentle weariness of a man who had seen too much but refused to let it harden him. Beside him always was Doc, his retired service dog. Doc was a German shepherd of distinguished age, his once solid black and tan coat now a noble tapestry of gray and white, particularly around his intelligent, ever-watchful eyes. To fill the quiet hours, Grant sought purpose. He found it in the glossy brochure for the Haven of Valor, a support center for homeless veterans on the outskirts of their small town. It was lauded on the local news, a shining example of a community giving back. The day they first visited, a fine mist clung to the air, making the center's modern glass and polished wood facade seem to gleam even brighter. Inside, the floors shone, the air smelled of lemon polish and fresh coffee, and a series of professionally printed posters showcasing smiling veterans lined the walls. A man with a smile as polished as the floorboards greeted them. He was Mr. Thompson, the center's director, a man who moved with the easy confidence of someone used to public praise. "Welcome, Grant. We are so thrilled to have you volunteer. And this must be Doc," he said, extending a hand toward the dog. And that was when the first crack appeared in the perfect facade. Doc, normally calm and receptive to friendly strangers, did not lean into the touch. Instead, he took a subtle step back, pressing his body against Grant's leg, a low, almost inaudible whine vibrating in his chest. Grant placed a reassuring hand on Doc's head, a silent apology to the director. "He's still adjusting to civilian life," Grant offered, the excuse feeling hollow even as he said it. As Mr. Thompson led them on a tour, pointing out the state-of-the-art kitchen and cheerful common rooms, Grant felt Doc's tension remain. The dog's gaze kept drifting away from the bright open spaces and toward the shadows. He would fixate on the quiet corners, where a few older, gaunt-looking men sat alone, their eyes downcast. Near them, Doc's low whine would return, his body language screaming a warning that only Grant could understand. Grant's own eyes followed his dog's, and for the first time he looked past the polish and the posters. An old instinct, the medic's gut feeling that something was deeply wrong, began to stir. The seed of doubt Doc had planted grew into a thorny vine in Grant's mind. During his next volunteer shifts, he moved with a quiet purpose, his friendly demeanor now, a careful mask for his sharp, observant eyes. He focused on the men who seemed to fade into the background, the ones Doc had instinctively identified. They shared a haunting similarity, a profound weariness in their bones, a shuffling gait, and eyes that never quite met his. When he tried to make conversation, the responses were always brief, polite, and strangely vacant, as if reciting lines from a script they had been forced to memorize. "The care here is wonderful," one would say without conviction. "We are very lucky," another would murmur, his gaze fixed on the floor. It was a cool afternoon, the sky a blanket of soft Oregon gray, when the truth finally broke the surface. Grant was walking Doc through the center's meticulously kept garden, the dog's leash loose in his hand. Suddenly, Doc stopped. He lifted his head, sniffing the air, and then gave a firm, insistent tug on the leash, pulling Grant away from the pristine rose bushes and toward a weathered wooden bench hidden behind a large weeping willow. There, sitting alone, was an elderly man, so thin his worn navy sweatshirt seemed to hang from his bony shoulders. His skin was like parchment, and his eyes held the distant, haunted look of someone lost at sea. Doc approached him not with the boisterous energy of a simple pet, but with the solemn grace of a creature that understood sorrow. He walked slowly, his claws making no sound on the stone path, and gently rested his great head on the man's knee. The man, whom Grant would later learn, was named Arthur, flinched at first, a lifetime of caution ingrained in his every muscle. But as he looked down into Doc's steady, compassionate gaze, something within him seemed to soften. A trembling hand rose and rested hesitantly on Doc's head, stroking the soft gray fur. For a fleeting moment, the wall around Arthur crumbled. His eyes darted around the garden, checking every shadow. Then, with a shaking hand, he quickly pushed up the sleeve of his sweatshirt. The sight struck Grant with the force of a physical blow. A dark, ugly bruise, a bloom of deep purple and sickly yellow, marred the thin skin of his forearm. Just below it, the angry red edge of a pressure sore was visible, a clear sign of medical neglect. Arthur's eyes, now wide with a terrifying mix of desperation and fear, met Grant's. He swiftly brought a single bony finger to his lips in a desperate plea for silence before yanking the sleeve down. The moment was over. The mask of quiet resignation fell back into place, but the horrifying truth was now exposed, burning in the space between them. The image of Arthur's bruised arm was a declaration of war. A hot soldier's anger surged through Grant, a primal instinct to charge in and protect the vulnerable. But the medic in him, the man trained to assess a situation before acting, held him back. He knew that a direct accusation against the celebrated Mr. Thompson would be dismissed as the ramblings of a newcomer. His word against a man shielded by years of positive press and community awards was no contest. To win this war, he had to fight it in the shadows. The next morning, he walked into Mr. Thompson's office with a calm and earnest expression. He told the director how moved he was by the center's mission and that he wanted to commit more of his time. He proposed becoming a full-time volunteer, and he added that Doc, with his gentle nature, could serve as an official therapy animal for the residents. Thompson's eyes lit up, not with compassion, but with the gleam of a new public relations angle. A dedicated volunteer and his loyal service dog, it was perfect. He agreed immediately. Grant's new role gave him the access he needed. His war was one of quiet observation, and his primary weapon was a gray and white German Shepherd. The excuse of taking Doc for walks allowed him to roam the facility at all hours. The deception was sickeningly clear. On days when local news crews or wealthy donors visited, the dining hall smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread. But when Grant walked Doc past the same hall late on a normal evening, he saw the men silently eating thin, watery soup from chipped bowls. The contrast was a slap in the face. It wasn't just neglect. It was a calculated, cruel performance. Doc continued to be his unerring guide. The dog, who was normally at ease in any environment, showed a consistent and specific aversion to one area, the hallway leading to the medical storage room. Every time they passed, Doc would slow his pace, the fur on his neck would bristle slightly, and a low growl would rumble in his chest. He would sniff intently at the base of the door, his discomfort obvious. Spurred by Doc's instinct, Grant began paying closer attention. He would linger nearby, pretending to adjust Doc's collar, and listen. He heard an older veteran ask a staff member for his blood pressure medication, only to be told it was out of stock. A few days later, another man's request for his prescribed painkillers was met with the same casual dismissal. Grant knew from his years as a medic that these were not rare or expensive drugs. For a facility with this much funding, being consistently out of stock was not just improbable, it was impossible. The records might be clean, but the truth was in the empty pill bottles and the suffering of the men. Observations were no longer enough. Grant needed proof, the kind of hard, undeniable evidence that could shatter Mr. Thompson's polished reputation. His mission became riskier. He started using his phone with practiced stealth, the device becoming an extension of his memory. He would angle it just so to photograph a plate of watery soup, its contents a pale shadow of a real meal. He would pretend to be checking messages while recording the cold, dismissive tone of a staff member refusing a veteran's request for fresh bandages. Each photo, each audio file, was a brick in the wall of truth he was building, but he knew it wasn't enough. He needed something that could not be explained away. He needed a smoking gun. The answer came late one night, long after the hollow silence had fallen over the center. Grant was taking Doc on his final walk when the dog began to act strangely near the stairwell to the basement. He whined, pulling insistently on the leash, his body rigid with purpose. Trusting the animal's instincts over his own fatigue, Grant followed him down into the dimly lit corridor. Doc went straight to the door of the laundry room, sniffing at the crack underneath, before letting out a low, urgent bark and scratching at the wood. The door was unlocked. Grant pushed it open, and a sour, cloying smell hit him. Inside, past the humming washing machines, stood several large trash bins. They were filled to the brim with unopened cartons of milk and nearly full trays of high-quality food: roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and soft bread rolls. It was the feast served to the donors just that afternoon, now discarded like common garbage. The sheer, calculated waste was breathtakingly cruel. As Grant stared in disgust, Doc ignored the food. He padded purposefully to the darkest corner of the room, to a rusty, forgotten filing cabinet. He nudged the cold metal with his nose and then looked back at Grant, a low whine rumbling in his throat. This was it. Grant found a small metal rod and, after a tense moment that felt like an eternity, managed to pry the lock open with a loud crack. He pulled open a drawer, thick with the dust of secrets. He picked up a folder at random. The name on the tab read, Arthur Me. His heart pounded against his ribs as he opened it. The pages inside were not the clean, printed reports he had seen upstairs. These were handwritten notes, filled with observations of progressive weight loss, worsening pressure sores on hip and shoulder, and repeated requests for pain medication denied. He pulled another file, then another. Each one told the same horrific story of malnutrition, untreated ailments, and willful neglect. Here, in the damp silence of the basement, Grant held the truth. It was ugly and undeniable. Back in the safety of his small home, Grant laid out the evidence on his kitchen table. The photographs of the meager meals, the audio of dismissive voices, and the damning copies of the real medical files formed a mosaic of cruelty. He considered his options. A legal battle would be a drawn-out, messy affair. Mr. Thompson, with his wealth and influence, could tie it up in court for years, twisting facts and discrediting witnesses. The men at the center would only suffer longer. No, a courtroom was the wrong battlefield. This war had to be won in the court of public opinion, and his weapon would be the undeniable truth. He picked up his phone and made a call to a trusted contact from his old Army unit, who gave him a name and a number. The name was Sarah. They met in a small diner 20 miles out of town, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of old coffee. Rain streamed down the windows, isolating them from the world. Sarah was already there. She was a woman in her late 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through him. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her demeanor was one of focused intensity. But when Grant mentioned that her father had served in the Marines, her expression softened for a fraction of a second, revealing the personal fire behind the professional journalist. He had chosen the right person. Without preamble, Grant slid a large manila envelope across the table. He told her everything, his voice low and steady. Sarah listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving his. She then opened the envelope and examined its contents. She looked at the photos of the wasted food, her lips tightening into a thin line. She read the copies of Arthur's real medical file, and a quiet, cold anger settled in her eyes. This was not just a story to her, it was a betrayal of a sacred trust. For the next hour, they weren't a source and a reporter. They were two strategists planning a campaign. They meticulously cross-referenced dates, verified details, and discussed how to protect the veterans from any blowback. They were building a case so airtight, so morally irrefutable, that it would leave no room for doubt or counterattack. The days that followed the meeting were a storm of anxiety for Grant. He continued his volunteer shifts, his face a mask of calm, while his stomach twisted into knots. In the long, quiet evenings, the weight of what he had set in motion pressed down on him. It was during these moments that Doc became his anchor. The great dog seemed to sense his turmoil. He would leave his favorite spot by the fireplace and rest his heavy, gray-muzzled head on Grant's lap, his warm presence a silent reassurance. Grant would stroke the dog's soft ears, and the simple, steady rhythm of Doc's breathing would be enough to calm his racing heart. The weapon was now in Sarah's hands, and all he could do was wait and trust in his silent, four-legged guardian to see him through the storm. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Sarah's article, titled "Betrayal at the Haven," was published on the front page of a national newspaper. It was not a pebble dropped in a pond, it was a boulder, sending a tidal wave of shock and outrage across the country. The public, who had once seen Mr. Thompson as a saint, now saw the monster behind the mask. The phones at the center rang off the hook, not with donations, but with fury. Within 48 hours, every major donor had publicly withdrawn their support, and the state had launched a full-scale formal investigation. The story did not linger on Mr. Thompson's fate. His downfall was swift and absolute, a footnote in the larger story of what came next. His empire of lies had crumbled into dust. The true victory was not in the collapse of the old, but in the building of the new. The Haven of Valor was officially dissolved, its name a permanent stain. In its place, a coalition of authentic, long-standing veteran support organizations stepped in. They were not interested in photo opportunities or glossy brochures. They were interested in the men. They quietly took over the facility, their first acts being to hire a new, fully qualified medical staff and to bring in counselors who specialized in trauma. Several months later, when the autumn leaves were turning to gold and crimson, Grant and Doc returned. The sign outside now read, "The Willamette Veterans Post." A simple, sturdy name. The aggressive shine of the place was gone. The floors were clean but not slick. The air smelled of hearty stew instead of harsh polish, and the walls were adorned with simple, framed photographs of the residents themselves. But the greatest change was the sound. The hollow silence had been replaced by the low murmur of genuine conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Grant saw Arthur in the common room, playing a game of checkers with another resident. He had gained weight, and the haunted, far-off look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a clear and present light. When he saw Grant and Doc, a real, unguarded smile spread across his face. "Well, look who it is," he said, his voice stronger than Grant had ever heard it. Doc trotted over, his tail wagging freely, and nudged his head into Arthur's outstretched hand. Arthur laughed, a full, hearty sound, as he scratched the dog behind the ears. There was no fear, no hesitation. This was the victory. It wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about this moment, the sound of laughter, the warmth of a true smile, and the restored dignity of a man who had been saved from the shadows. And at the center of it all was Doc, the loyal soldier who had smelled the deceit and led them all into the light. Grant and Doc's journey shows us that true loyalty often speaks without words, and that the courage to face a hidden darkness can be found in the steady presence of a faithful friend. It is a powerful reminder that one quiet voice, speaking an undeniable truth, can be enough to bring back the light. If their story of quiet bravery and unbreakable trust touched your heart, we would be honored if you would subscribe to Voice of Pause and share this message of hope. Every like and comment helps these stories reach those who need to hear them. Your next journey with us can begin right now, just by clicking on the new video that has appeared on your screen.